The alien crowd filled the grand arena, their voices rising in an electrifying roar. Towering banners of the Valrek Empire hung high above the battle pit, their golden emblems shining under the artificial lights. The scent of burning metal and charged energy filled the air, a sign that today's challenge was not just any fight, it was a spectacle. At the center of the pit stood General Vekra, the most feared warrior of the Valrek species. Her deep blue skin shimmered under the lights, her armor reinforced with the finest alien alloy, her twin plasma blades humming as she activated them with a flick of her wrist. She was taller than any human, her muscles honed from years of war. Opposite her, standing alone with nothing but his wits and his combat training, was Commander Jack Carter, a human. To the Valrek people, he was a curiosity, an anomaly that had somehow survived the brutal conflicts of the galaxy. But to Vekra, he was nothing more than a weak, arrogant creature who had stumbled too far into enemy territory. "You dare call yourself strong?" Vekra's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Jack. "Prove it, human." Jack tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't as large as the alien warriors who surrounded him, nor did he carry the advanced weapons they did. But he stood with a relaxed confidence, his muscles coiled beneath his simple combat uniform. A faint smirk played at the corner of his lips. "Be careful what you wish for," he said, his voice steady. The audience erupted into laughter. The Valrek warriors banged their weapons against their armored chests, mocking the humans' audacity. They had seen countless challengers step into this arena against General Vekra. None had left standing. A deep, guttural drum echoed through the chamber, signaling the start of the fight. Vekra wasted no time. She lunged, her speed unnatural for a creature of her size, her blade slicing through the air with lethal precision. Jack sidestepped at the last possible moment, the heat from the plasma blades just barely missing his skin. The crowd gasped. Vekra didn't pause. She followed up with another strike, a downward slash meant to cleave the human in half. But again, Jack was gone before the blade could find its mark. His movements were sharp, calculated, not wild, not panicked. He was studying her. For the first time, Vekra hesitated. She had fought countless battles, defeated enemies far stronger than this human. But there was something unsettling about the way he moved. He was fast, not just fast, but precise. He wasn't reacting out of fear. He was reacting with purpose. Jack took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving her. "You're strong," he admitted, rolling his shoulders as if warming up. "But strength isn't everything." Vekra's expression darkened. Enough of this. She fainted left before twisting into a brutal spinning kick, catching Jack by surprise. He barely managed to throw up his arms in time to block the impact. The force sent him skidding backward across the arena floor. Pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and stayed on his feet. The crowd roared with approval, convinced the fight was over. Jack chuckled under his breath. "That all you got?" he asked, rolling his wrists. Vekra's eyes narrowed. She charged again, but this time, Jack didn't retreat. He stepped in, his movements fluid, and before she could react, he shifted his weight and dodged beneath her swing. His elbow shot out, catching her square in the ribs. It wasn't a devastating blow, but it was enough to make her stumble. The arena fell into stunned silence. A human had just landed a hit on General Vekra. Jack took a step back, watching her closely. "You're strong," he repeated, "but you have a weakness." Vekra straightened, her face twisting with fury. Jack smiled, just enough to let her know he wasn't afraid. He had her attention now. The fight was far from over. The silence in the arena was heavy, the weight of disbelief pressing down on the thousands of alien spectators. A human had struck General Vekra. It was a small hit, just an elbow to the ribs, but it was more than anyone had ever managed before. The Valrek warriors who had been laughing at Jack moments ago now leaned forward, their ridged brows furrowed in confusion. This was not how the fight was supposed to go. Vekra's breathing was controlled, but her fists clenched tighter around the hilts of her plasma blades. Her pride burned hotter than the pain in her ribs. No human should have been able to touch her, not even by accident. Yet Jack Carter stood before her, calm, analyzing her like she was nothing more than a puzzle waiting to be solved. "You're starting to annoy me, human," she said, her voice low, dangerous. Jack rolled his shoulders, shaking the tension out of his arms. "Good," he said. "That means you'll start making mistakes." A growl rumbled from deep within Vekra's chest. She shifted her stance, adjusting the grip on her blades. No more testing him. No more underestimating. This human had done something no one else had ever done. That meant he was a threat, and threats needed to be crushed. She surged forward with speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone of her size. The plasma blades moved like streaks of burning light, slashing toward Jack with precise, deadly arcs. But Jack was ready. He ducked under the first strike, narrowly avoiding the sizzling energy that would have cut him in half. The second strike came instantly, a downward cleave meant to split his skull. Jack twisted his body at the last second, feeling the heat of the blade singe the fabric of his uniform as he slipped past the attack. He spun, using his momentum to deliver a powerful kick to the back of Vekra's knee. The impact forced her to stagger, just enough for Jack to disengage and put some distance between them. The crowd gasped again. This wasn't luck. This wasn't desperation. This was skill. Vekra's frustration was evident in the sharp flick of her blades as she reset her stance. Jack didn't look like a warrior. His physique was leaner than the brute strength of the Valrek warriors. His weapons, well, he didn't have any. And yet, he was fighting like someone who had been in 1,000 battles. Someone who knew exactly how to survive. Jack smirked. "You're fast," he admitted, flexing his fingers. "But you commit too much to every attack." Vekra's nostrils flared. "You speak as if you've already won." Jack tilted his head. "Not yet." Vekra rushed forward again, but this time, Jack didn't retreat. He met her charge head-on, weaving through her strikes with the precision of a master fighter. Each attack she threw at him, he avoided by the slimmest margin, conserving his energy while she burned through hers. He was forcing her to exhaust herself. The Valrek warriors in the stands began to murmur. This wasn't just a lucky human who had gotten in a few hits. This was a strategy. Jack saw an opening. Vekra was fast, but she was growing impatient. She swung too wide on her next strike, and Jack stepped into her guard. He grabbed her wrist in a sudden, unexpected move and twisted sharply. Pain lanced through her arm, forcing her to release one of her blades. The weapon clattered to the ground. The silence was deafening. Vekra's mind raced. This wasn't possible. No human should be able to react this quickly, to read her movements so perfectly. He wasn't stronger than her, and yet, here he was, stripping away her advantage piece by piece. She snarled, her free hand darting toward him in an attempt to grab him by the throat. But Jack was already gone, slipping away before she could close her fingers around him. He moved like liquid, unpredictable and relentless. Jack took a few steps back, his hands still loose at his sides, as if he hadn't just disarmed one of the greatest warriors of the Valrek Empire. "That was your first mistake," he said, nodding toward her fallen weapon. Vekra seethed. Her chest rose and fell with barely contained fury. No opponent had ever embarrassed her like this. "You're playing a dangerous game, human," she warned. Jack's grin widened. "Good thing I like danger." Vekra picked up her fallen weapon, gripping it tightly. Her muscles tensed, but Jack could see it now. Hesitation, doubt, a crack in her confidence. The crowd had started watching Jack differently, no longer as an amusing underdog, but as something else, something unpredictable, something dangerous. For the first time in her life, General Vekra felt something unfamiliar creeping into her thoughts. A sliver of fear. The air in the arena had changed. The energy that once crackled with the certainty of Vekra's victory now wavered, unsteady and uncertain. The Valrek warriors who had been cheering for their general just moments ago had grown silent, their expressions shifting from amusement to something closer to unease. Vekra could feel their eyes on her. She could feel their expectations, their faith in her strength, pressing down like a weight. She had never lost before, never even come close. She was the pride of the Valrek Empire, the finest warrior among their ranks. And yet, a single human, fragile, weaponless, and small, had not only withstood her attacks, but had exposed her weaknesses for all to see. She had to end this. Now. With a sharp breath, Vekra adjusted her grip on her blades, her muscles tightening. She had been holding back before, treating Jack like an annoyance rather than a genuine threat. That mistake would not be made again. Jack, on the other hand, remained relaxed, his posture unreadable. He was watching her with that same calm expression, those sharp, calculating eyes. It was infuriating. "Are we done playing?" she asked, her voice carrying over the silent crowd. Jack smirked. "I was wondering when you'd start taking this seriously." Vekra didn't wait for him to finish. She launched forward at full speed, her body a blur of movement. Her strikes came faster than before, each one precise and deadly. The ground beneath them cracked under the force of her blows, the sheer heat of her plasma blades warping the air around them. She wasn't just attacking. She was overwhelming him, giving him no room to breathe, no space to counter. Jack dodged, barely, his reflexes pushed to the limit. He twisted, shifted, maneuvered between her strikes with an agility that shouldn't have been possible for a human. But even he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. She was adapting, getting faster. And worse, she was angry. A fraction of a second too slow. Jack felt the heat of her blade skim past his side, searing the fabric of his uniform. Pain flared up his ribs, but he clenched his jaw and forced himself to move, to keep going. Vekra saw the hit land and pressed harder, her confidence surging. "You're slowing down, human," she taunted, her strikes relentless. Jack didn't respond. He was waiting for the right moment. Then he saw it. Vekra overcommitted to a heavy downward slash, putting all her strength into it. The blade crashed into the ground with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave of energy across the arena floor. Dust and debris exploded into the air, momentarily blinding the audience. And in that instant, Jack struck. He moved in close, faster than Vekra could react. His foot hooked behind her ankle, and with a sharp twist of his body, he sent her off balance. She stumbled, caught off guard, and Jack seized his opening. His fist shot forward, slamming into her side with full force. It wasn't just a strike. It was placed precisely where he had hit her earlier, the same weak spot he had identified before. Pain exploded through Vekra's ribs, her breath hitching. She barely managed to catch herself before she hit the ground, her boots skidding against the dirt. She turned, enraged, but Jack was already retreating, stepping just out of her reach. The crowd was in disbelief. No one had ever forced Vekra to stumble. No one had ever forced her to show pain. Vekra's fury burned hotter than the plasma in her hands. "You fight like a coward," she spat. Jack exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "No, I fight to win." Vekra's grip on her blades tightened. Her body ached from the repeated blows, but she forced herself to focus. Jack was unpredictable, unlike any opponent she had ever faced. He didn't rely on brute strength or overwhelming power. He was using strategy, speed, and something far more dangerous: patience. She couldn't beat him like this. Her eyes flickered to the Emperor's viewing platform, where the highest-ranking Valrek officials watched in silence. She could feel their disappointment, their judgment. If she lost here, it wouldn't just be her pride that suffered. She couldn't afford that. Without a word, she reached toward the panel on her wrist, pressing a hidden sequence of buttons. Jack's instincts flared with warning. Something wasn't right. The moment the sequence was complete, Vekra's armor pulsed with energy. A surge of power rippled through her body, enhancing her movements, increasing her strength beyond its natural limits. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You're using tech enhancements." The crowd didn't react. They didn't protest. This wasn't just a fight. It was a show, and the show had to continue, no matter the cost. Vekra smirked. "Let's see you dodge now, human." Then she vanished. Jack barely had time to react before she was on him, her speed nearly doubling. He twisted, barely dodging the first strike, but the second slammed into him like a wrecking ball. He was sent flying across the arena, crashing hard into the stone barrier. Pain exploded through his back, his vision flashing white for a split second. The audience roared in approval. Vekra stalked toward him, her steps slow, deliberate. "Did you really think a mere human could defeat me?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement. Jack groaned, forcing himself to stand. His limbs ached, his ribs throbbed, but he refused to stay down. Vekra raised her blade. "This ends now." She lunged. Jack's mind worked faster than his body, running through every possibility, every escape route. But there was no room left to dodge, no time left to counter. As the plasma blade came down, Jack did the only thing he could. He caught it. The audience gasped as Jack's hands clamped down on the burning hot blade. The heat seared into his skin, pain flaring up his arms. But he didn't let go. Vekra's eyes widened in shock. Jack, through gritted teeth, managed a smirk. "You really should have finished this when you had the chance." Then, with one swift move, he turned the fight on its head. The searing heat of the plasma blade burned against Jack's palms, but he didn't let go. The pain was unbearable, white-hot agony ripping through his nerves, but he locked his fingers around the weapon with sheer force of will. The alien crowd erupted in disbelief, their voices a cacophony of gasps and shouts. No human, no creature, should have been able to catch a Valrek warrior's plasma blade with bare hands. It was suicide. It was madness. And yet Jack stood there, his grip unshaken. Vekra's eyes widened in shock. She had expected him to fall, to break under the force of her enhanced strength. Instead, he was holding her weapon in place, preventing the killing blow. And then, before she could react, Jack twisted his body, using the momentum of her own strike against her. Vekra's stance wavered as Jack wrenched the blade to the side, forcing her forward. She lost her balance for just a second, just long enough for Jack to release the weapon and drive his knee into her stomach with brutal force. The impact sent her staggering backward, her armor absorbing some of the damage, but not nearly enough. She let out a sharp exhale, trying to regain her footing, but Jack didn't stop. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist before she could raise her weapon again, twisting with precise control. There was a sharp crack as Vekra's wrist bent at an unnatural angle, forcing her to drop one of her blades. The Valrek warriors watching from the stands were frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Their strongest warrior was losing, to a human. Vekra let out a furious snarl, wrenching her arm free. She jumped back, eyes blazing with rage and disbelief. "You should be dead," she spat, flexing her injured wrist. Her armor's enhancements had made her stronger, faster. There was no reason she should be struggling against this creature. Jack wiped sweat from his brow, his breathing heavy but steady. His hands were raw, scorched from the plasma blade, but he ignored the pain. "Yeah," he said, rolling his shoulders. "I get that a lot." Vekra growled, shaking off the lingering ache in her ribs. Her pride had already taken a hit, but she would not, could not, let herself fall to a human. She reached for the controls on her wrist, ready to activate another enhancement, but Jack had been watching her closely. The second her fingers twitched toward the panel, he moved. Jack darted in faster than she expected, his fist slamming into her forearm with pinpoint precision. The impact disrupted the controls before she could activate them. Sparks flew from the damaged panel, and suddenly, the enhanced strength she had relied on flickered and died. The crowd gasped. Jack had just disabled her combat enhancements. Vekra's eyes went wide with realization, but before she could react, Jack delivered another crushing blow, striking just below her ribs, the same spot he had targeted before. The force of the punch sent her stumbling backward, her footing unsteady. She had underestimated him. That much was clear now. This human wasn't just fast. He was dangerous. He had been studying her, adapting to her movements, anticipating her strategies. For the first time in her life, Vekra was fighting someone she couldn't overpower. A bead of sweat dripped down her temple as she steadied herself. Jack stood across from her, fists raised, his face set in an expression of calm determination. His uniform was torn, his hands burned, but his stance never wavered. The Valrek warriors watching from the stands had stopped cheering. Their expressions had shifted from excitement to something else. Uncertainty. Jack noticed it. They're realizing it now, he thought. Humans aren't weak. We never were. Vekra let out a slow breath, her muscles burning, her pride stinging. You're different, she admitted. Jack exhaled, rolling his neck. I've heard that before. Vekra studied him for a long moment, then activated the hilt of her remaining plasma blade. The hum of energy filled the silence. This fight isn't over. Jack smirked. Good, he said, flexing his fingers. I was just getting started. Vekra lunged forward with renewed fury, her blade a blur of light, as she struck again. Jack met her advance, his movements fluid and controlled, dodging just enough to stay out of reach. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, it wasn't clear who would win. The fight stretched on, each strike faster, each movement sharper. The air in the arena had become thick with tension, the energy of the crowd shifting from excitement to stunned silence. The Valrek warriors had never seen a battle like this before. Their greatest general, their undefeated champion, was locked in combat with a human who refused to fall. Jack moved with precision, his breath controlled despite the burning pain in his hands and the ache spreading through his ribs. Vekra was relentless, pushing forward with sheer force, her remaining plasma blade a streak of violet energy as it slashed through the air. But Jack had already learned her rhythm. Every fighter had patterns, even the best ones. And Vekra's greatest strength, her raw power, was also her biggest flaw. She fought to overwhelm, to crush her opponents beneath the weight of her strength. But Jack wasn't someone who could be crushed. He was someone who endured. Vekra feinted left, then spun into a brutal diagonal slash. The plasma blade cut through the air like lightning, its energy distorting the space around it. Jack barely ducked in time, feeling the heat of the blade pass just inches from his face. He didn't counter immediately. Instead, he let her overextend again, let her push too far forward. And then, in one fluid motion, he dropped low and swept her legs from under her. Vekra hit the ground hard, her armor scraping against the stone floor of the arena. The impact sent a shockwave through the stands. The audience gasped, an unfamiliar sound in a battle they had always believed was predictable. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward, driving his knee into her chest, pinning her down. His forearm pressed against her throat, his weight holding her still. For the first time, Vekra found herself trapped. The energy blade in her hand flared dangerously close to his side, but Jack grabbed her wrist, forcing it away from his body. The two locked eyes, hers burning with fury, his calm and steady. "You've already lost," Jack said, his voice even. Vekra growled, straining against him. "I never lose." Jack smirked. "Then I guess there's a first time for everything." Vekra's breathing was heavy, her muscles straining. But she didn't struggle wildly. She was thinking, calculating her next move. Jack could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just strong. She was disciplined, smart. The problem was, she had never faced someone like him before. Someone who fought with endurance rather than brute force. Then, to Jack's surprise, she laughed. It was a low, bitter sound at first, but then it grew, echoing through the arena. Jack felt the vibrations of it beneath his hands, the way her shoulders shook with it. Unbelievable, she muttered, staring up at him. You actually think you've won? Jack narrowed his eyes. Looks that way from here. Vekra's smirk widened. Then why haven't they stopped the fight? Jack didn't get a chance to process her words before he felt it. A shift in the air, a presence behind him. Instinct kicked in, but it was too late. A massive force slammed into his back, sending him flying off Vekra and skidding across the floor. Pain exploded through his ribs as he coughed, forcing himself up just in time to see two Valrek guards stepping onto the battlefield, their massive forms blocking his path. They weren't supposed to be here. This was supposed to be a one-on-one duel. Jack's jaw clenched. He should have expected this. The fight had gone on too long. The Valrek leaders wouldn't allow their champion to lose. Vekra sat up, rubbing her throat before standing to her full height. She rolled her shoulders, shaking off the last remnants of the fight as she retrieved her fallen blade. The enhancements in her armor flickered back to life, the damage Jack had caused already being repaired by the advanced technology. Jack exhaled sharply. He had fought harder than ever before, but now the game had changed. It wasn't just Vekra anymore. He was outnumbered. The Valrek Emperor stood from his throne high above the arena, his voice booming across the battlefield. A warrior who cannot stand against many is no warrior at all, he declared. Let us see if the human can survive when the odds are real. The crowd erupted in cheers. Jack wiped the blood from his mouth and exhaled. Well, he muttered to himself, flexing his fingers. This just got interesting. Vekra tilted her head, watching him carefully. There was something new in her gaze. Respect. She hadn't needed the interference. She knew it. He knew it. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to finish him like this. But the Valrek Empire didn't care what she wanted. Jack glanced at the two new warriors closing in. He could feel his heart pounding, but not from fear. No, fear had left him long ago. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about proving something far bigger than himself. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The two Valrek guards moved in, their heavy boots cracking against the stone floor of the arena. They were massive, even compared to Vekra, their dark armor reinforced with thick plates of alien alloy. Their weapons, electrified glaives taller than Jack himself, crackled with energy as they stepped into position, flanking him on either side. Jack exhaled, flexing his fingers. His body was already battered from his fight with Vekra, his ribs aching with every breath. The burns on his hands still throbbed, and his muscles screamed for relief. But he pushed the pain away. Pain was just another problem to manage. Right now, the only thing that mattered was survival. Above the arena, the Valrek Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his sharp golden eyes watching with amusement. A human who fights well against one opponent is impressive, he mused, his voice carrying over the arena. But true warriors do not falter when faced with the impossible. The crowd cheered in agreement. They wanted blood. They wanted dominance. They wanted to see Jack broken. Vekra stood off to the side, her breathing steady now, her weapons deactivated. She was watching closely, her expression unreadable. Jack had expected her to look pleased that reinforcements had arrived to finish him off. Instead, she looked irritated. One of the Valrek guards sneered, gripping his weapon tighter. You fought well, human, he admitted, his voice like gravel. But this is where it ends. Jack rolled his shoulders. Everyone keeps saying that, he said, shaking out his sore limbs. And yet, here I am. The first guard didn't wait for another word. He lunged forward, his glaive swinging in a brutal arc meant to take Jack's head off. Jack ducked, narrowly avoiding the electric blade as it sliced through the air. But before he could counter, the second guard moved in from behind, bringing his weapon down like a hammer. Jack twisted at the last second, barely rolling out of the way as the blade struck the ground, sending sparks flying. Too slow, too close. They were faster than he expected. Not as skilled as Vekra, but stronger, heavier, relentless. This wasn't like fighting a single opponent. There was no time to analyze, no room for careful observation. He had to move, had to react on instinct alone. One of the guards swung again, and Jack barely managed to redirect the blow, using the momentum to pivot around the massive alien. He drove his elbow into the warrior's side, but it was like hitting a steel wall. The alien barely flinched. The second guard came from the left, aiming for his legs. Jack jumped, flipping over the attack, but before he could land, a fist the size of his head slammed into his ribs. A flash of pain exploded through his body. Jack hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his bones. The taste of copper filled his mouth as he rolled onto his back, blinking against the bright arena lights. The crowd roared. The first guard stomped toward him, his weapon buzzing with energy. "You lasted longer than most," he said, raising the glaive over his head for a final strike. Jack exhaled sharply. "Think, Carter. Think." His body was failing him. His muscles were too slow, his lungs burning. He couldn't outmatch them in strength. He couldn't endure another direct hit. But endurance wasn't his greatest weapon. His mind was. At the last second, as the guard's weapon came down, Jack twisted his body and kicked up a handful of dirt from the arena floor. The dust clouded the air, stinging the alien's eyes. The moment of distraction was all Jack needed. He rolled to the side, just as the glaive struck the ground, missing him by mere inches. Using the momentum, Jack pushed off the ground and shot forward, his fist connecting with the alien's throat. The warrior choked, staggering back, his grip on his weapon faltering. Jack didn't stop. He spun toward the second guard, dodging another incoming strike, and grabbed hold of the first guard's glaive before it could fully fall. In one smooth motion, he ripped the weapon from the alien's grasp. The crowd went silent. Jack felt the weight of the glaive in his hands, heavier than he was used to, but balanced. The electric current buzzed through his grip, but he ignored the sting. The second guard hesitated. Jack smirked. "Not so fun when I'm armed." Before the guard could react, Jack moved. He swung the glaive in a precise arc, his human agility and speed allowing him to strike before the alien could counter. The electrified blade sliced clean through the warrior's armor, sending a surge of energy through his body. The alien crashed to the ground. The silence in the arena stretched for a long moment. Jack stood there, chest heaving, glaive in hand, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. The remaining guard, now weaponless, stared at him in shock. And then the unthinkable happened. Vekra stepped forward. The crowd hushed as she moved into the arena, her gaze locked onto Jack. He watched her carefully, his grip tightening on the glaive. She didn't look at the fallen warriors. She didn't look at the Emperor. She only looked at him. Then, in a low voice, she said, "Enough." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "General Vekra." "No." She turned, her expression fierce. "This fight is done. If he was truly weak, he would be dead. But he is standing. That is victory." A murmur rippled through the arena. The Valrek warriors shifted, uncertain. Jack exhaled, lowering the glaive slightly. He wasn't sure what game she was playing, but he wasn't about to question it. The Emperor studied her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a deep, booming sound. "You are a strange human," he mused, leaning back on his throne. "Very well. The battle is over." The energy in the arena changed instantly. Some warriors grumbled in disappointment. Others looked at Jack with something new in their eyes. Respect. Vekra turned back to him, stepping closer. There was still a fire in her gaze, but it was different now. It wasn't fury. It was understanding. "You fought well," she said, her voice quieter now. "Better than I expected." Jack exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax. "You're not so bad yourself," he muttered, rolling his aching shoulders. Vekra smirked. "I want to fight you again." Jack let out a dry chuckle. "Next time, let's skip the part where your friends try to kill me." She tilted her head. We'll see. And with that, the arena doors opened. Jack had survived. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Jack stood in the center of the arena, still catching his breath, his grip tightening on the stolen glaive. His body ached from the brutal fight, his ribs screaming with every movement, but he refused to show weakness. Not here. Not now. The Valrek warriors still surrounded him, their expressions unreadable. Some looked at him with disdain, others with grudging respect. The Emperor had declared the battle over, but the tension in the air had not faded. Vekra remained standing a few feet away, her violet eyes locked onto him. The fire in her gaze had shifted, no longer the smoldering rage of a warrior looking to crush her enemy, but something else. Curiosity, recognition, a hint of something Jack hadn't expected, acceptance. The Emperor, seated high above the arena, leaned forward, studying Jack with amusement. A human warrior, standing victorious in the heart of the Valrek Empire, a sight I never thought I would witness. Jack wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and forced himself to stand straighter, ignoring the throbbing pain in his side. Yeah, well, he muttered, rolling his sore shoulder, I like to keep things interesting. The Emperor let out a deep chuckle, the sound reverberating through the grand hall. You have earned your life today, human. A rare thing for an outsider. Jack didn't miss the underlying message. He had earned his survival. Not because the Valrek were merciful, but because he had fought hard enough to make them respect him. It was a victory, but not one without consequences. Vekra stepped closer, her voice low enough that only he could hear. You should leave while you can, she murmured. Jack raised an eyebrow. That a threat? Her lips twitched in something close to a smirk. A warning. Jack exhaled, glancing around at the Valrek warriors who still watched him, their eyes filled with something between admiration and challenge. He had made an impression, but that was dangerous. These were a people who thrived on power, on dominance. They had seen him fight, and that meant one thing. More of them would want to test him. He wasn't sure how many more fights he could survive. Smart, Jack admitted, tossing the stolen glaive to the ground. But I don't take orders well. Vekra's gaze darkened, but there was no anger there this time. That's obvious. The Emperor gestured lazily toward him. Tell me, human, who all of your kind fight like this? Jack shrugged. Most don't. He cracked his neck. But the ones who do, you don't want to meet them in a dark alley. The Emperor chuckled again, but there was something thoughtful in his expression now. You intrigue me, human. You fight like someone who has nothing to lose. Jack didn't answer, because maybe that was true. The Emperor leaned back, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his throne. You have spilled blood in my arena, humiliated my greatest general, and still stand before me with fire in your eyes. That is not something I can ignore. Jack's body tensed. The tone in the Emperor's voice had changed, the air shifting again. The battle had ended, but something else was about to begin. You could leave, the Emperor mused. Return to your people, carry this victory with you. Or, Jack waited. You could stay. The Emperor's golden eyes gleamed. Become something greater. Jack blinked. That he hadn't expected. You want me to stay? He asked, tilting his head. The Emperor smiled. You have proven yourself worthy. And I have need of warriors who think differently. Jack glanced at Vekra. She didn't react, but he could see it in the way her jaw tightened. She hadn't expected this either. Let me guess, Jack muttered. There's a war coming. The Emperor's smile widened. There is always a war coming. Jack exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had come here expecting to fight for his life, expecting to be outmatched, outgunned. But now he was being offered something more. A chance. A choice. Vekra finally spoke. You don't belong here. Jack met her gaze. Yeah. He let the moment stretch before he smirked. Funny. I keep hearing that. And yet, here I am. She stared at him for a long moment before shaking her head. "You are impossible." Jack grinned. "I get that a lot." The Emperor stood, and the crowd immediately fell silent. "Decide, human," he said, his voice carrying across the arena. "Will you walk away, or will you fight for something greater than yourself?" Jack looked around, taking it all in. The towering warriors, the endless possibilities, the danger, the challenge. He grinned. "Well," he muttered to himself, rolling his sore shoulders, "guess I'll have to keep things interesting." And just like that, everything changed. Again.